Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Today we'll be taking a deep dive into making effective metrics and targets disclosure and offering tips and tricks to help you on your TCFD journey. Today's webinar will be recorded and we will follow up with a copy of the recording and the slides afterwards. So today's webinar comes at a time when climate risk is high on agendas worldwide and climate-related financial disclosure is increasingly gaining prominence. CDP has just released its A-list and found that companies on the climate A-list outperform their peers on the stock market by 5.5% per annum according to stocks. And already we've seen the results of the West Global Risk Report, and for the first time ever, the top 5 global risks in terms of likelihood are all environmental. So with that in mind, I'm thrilled to introduce you to today's speakers. Marie-Pierre is the Science-Based Targets Implementation Director at Danone, and Sundip is the Technical Manager here at CDSB. And my name is Leslie McKenna. I'm the Communications Manager, and I'll be your moderator for today. We will be taking questions and answers at the end of the webinar, so please do put your questions in using the Q&A function on the right-hand side. We'll also run a short poll just to get a level of understanding of the participants' knowledge regarding the TCFD recommendations. And the question we are asking is, how would you describe your understanding of the TCFD recommendations? A, I am an expert. B, I am confident. C, I have some knowledge. Or D, I have little knowledge. So quite interestingly, and similar to our other webinars, the majority of the audience need to sit within the I have some knowledge. So I think that's a great level to be at today, especially because the idea around these the webinars are to take an in-depth look at specific elements of the TCFD recommendations. So with that, I am going to hand you over to my colleague Sundip, who's going to speak to you a little bit more about our work here at TCFD and explore the current state of TCFD aligned disclosure to date.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Firstly, a quick introduction to the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, CDSB. CDSB is a consortium of 9 environmental and business NGOs, including the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, and the World Economic Forum. We were set up in Davos in 2007 with a mission to create enabling conditions for material, climate change, and natural capital information to be integrated into the mainstream report. Some of the members from our technical working group can also be seen on screen. So, why are we here today? Well, the CDSB has a framework for reporting environmental and climate change information. It consists of 7 guiding principles, the how, and 12 reporting requirements, the what. The framework is fully aligned with the TCFD recommendations and principles, and in fact, TCFD was developed based on the CDSB framework and other leading reporting frameworks. Therefore, it's complementary to existing provisions such as CDP, GRI, SASB, and existing regulations. For example, the framework is referenced in the EU's Non-Financial Reporting Directive and Stock Exchange Guidance globally. Now, moving on to the TCFD guidelines themselves. Per the poll results, everyone at least has some knowledge of the TCFD, but a quick reminder for us all as to why this work is so critical. Per the graph on the right, there are a range of pathways we may end up going down in relation to policy responses to global warming, and thus the actual warming impact is relatively unclear. And without companies being transparent, it's difficult to ascertain how they might be impacted by different climate pathways. Generally speaking, there's a lack of disclosure on climate-related financial information by companies. Even if there are disclosures, reporting is inconsistent. There's a lack of context, and often boilerplate and non-comparable information is disclosed. This lack of consistent information hinders investors and other stakeholders from considering climate-related issues in the decision-making process. The Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, was set up in 2015 to develop voluntary, consistent climate-related financial disclosures to be included in the mainstream report for use by companies in providing information to investors, lenders, insurers, and other stakeholders. TCFD considers both physical and transition risks, as well as opportunities associated with climate change and what constitutes effective financial disclosures across different industries. The recommendations are for companies to take a forward-looking approach, considering climate-related risks over different timeframes, with inclusion of both qualitative and quantitative disclosures, particularly relevant for today's session on metrics and targets. So before moving on to the core part of today's session, let's have a look at how companies have got on TCFD-aligned reporting so far per the most recent TCFD status report from 2019. The status report had 4 key findings. Despite support for the TCFD rising by more than half since September 2018, companies are still finding it a challenge to implement the recommendations, resulting in insufficient disclosure for investors. More clarity is needed on the potential financial impacts of climate-related issues. The majority of companies do not disclose information on resilience. And finally, mainstreaming climate-related issues requires the involvement of multiple functions within business. So, focusing on the metrics and targets element of the recommendations, which is the focus of today's webinar, per the 2019 status report, less than half of companies on average produce disclosures on metrics and targets generally. Nearly 50% of companies on average disclosed on climate-related metrics, while only 1/3 on average produced greenhouse gas emission metrics. Looking at a selection of sectors, materials and buildings has been the best performer, with consumer goods, banking and energy sectors close behind. Geographically, I expect that most of our participants on this morning's, or at least from my time, this morning's session will be from Europe and Asia Pacific. And the status report found that European companies on average outperformed across the board. Hopefully that's given you a flavour of where things are. Let's move on to the actual recommendations themselves. So the metrics and targets element of the recommendations ask companies to disclose the metrics and targets companies use to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. A reminder that unlike governance and risk management, metrics and targets disclosures only need to be produced in the mainstream annual report where it is deemed material. Also, keep in mind that each of the 4 elements of the recommendations should be considered together and not as separate elements. So, the first recommendation, where companies should disclose the metrics used to assess climate-related risks and opportunities in line with its strategy and risk management processes. Now, in order to do this, you should be thinking about the performance metrics you use to assess and manage financially material climate-related risks and opportunities. For example, a specific climate-related risk may have been identified for which processes have been put in place to manage the risk. As part of this, disclose the metrics you will be using to assess and manage the risk. Similarly, as part of the company's strategy, climate-related opportunities may have been identified, such as products and services designed for a lower carbon economy. Disclose the metrics that the company uses to monitor how you are progressing with taking advantage of the opportunity. The second recommendation is for companies to disclose their Scope 1 and Scope 2, and if appropriate, Scope 3 greenhouse emissions and related risks. At a high level, Scope 1 emissions refer to all direct emissions from the activities of an organization, such as fuel combustion on site, and fleet vehicles as well. Scope 2 covers indirect emissions from electricity purchased and used by the organization. Scope 3 covers all other indirect emissions from the activities of the organization, for example, business travel, procurement, and waste. This is often the greatest share of emissions. I've pulled out some of the KPIs from the Italian oil and gas company Eni's 2018 annual report. The extract only includes Scope 1 emissions generated from different sources, but the full table in its annual report covers Scope 2 and 3. Companies should be trying to include the metrics for prior periods in order to illustrate to users the overall trend of the metric in question. So this applies to all metrics, not just greenhouse emissions. In this example, Eni discloses its absolute Scope 1 emissions, absolute meaning the total emissions in each year from its various sources. They also include an intensity metric, in this case the carbon efficiency index the carbon efficiency index of tons of carbon dioxide per barrel oil equivalent, which is basically a relative measure of carbon dioxide against a base. So for example, an asset manager might disclose emissions per asset under management, or a real estate company might disclose emissions per square foot of real estate owned, alongside the absolute emissions to aid investors and allow comparability with peer companies by using a normalized base. Some further things to consider: have your greenhouse gas emissions been calculated using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol methodology, GHG? And if so, have you referenced this? Again, this allows users to aggregate and compare across organizations and jurisdictions. Consider using sector-specific efficiency ratios applicable to your company, as we saw on the previous slide. Again, this aids comparability. And finally, it's not simply about producing the numbers. You should also be providing narrative on what the numbers mean for your business and what the related risks are. The final recommendation focuses on the targets part of metrics and targets. So describe the targets used to manage climate-related risks and opportunities and the performance against those targets. The point here is around transparency for the user. So first, is the target absolute or based on intensity? Second, the timeframes over which their targets apply should be disclosed. Again, this should be linked to the relevant risk or opportunity. If you've identified a likely risk in the next 15 years, the timeframe of the target should be related. And third, be transparent on the base year from which progress is measured against target. So for example, reducing carbon emissions by 90% by 2030 using a 2015 base level is very different to using a 1995 base level. Now, you should always keep in mind the information being disclosed and should be decision useful for key users. So a key user for climate-related information are the investors. Our friends at CDSB have surveyed some investors to understand what they consider to be decision useful TCFD disclosures. Investors want to know how the targets set relate to the company's strategy, and they value being able to track and understand progress against the target. You can do this by including historical performance data to show trends and progress over time, i.e. include the prior year comparatives, ideally for multiple years. Also, include the methodology used to calculate the metrics. This enhances the comparability of performance data across similar companies. And finally, the inclusion of more robust normalization factors facilitates comparability. And by this, I mean relative values in addition to absolute values. Now, one point to keep in mind, whether you're starting out or developing climate-related metrics and targets, or building on what you're already doing, is to not reinvent the wheel. It's far easier to draw on existing standards on metrics reporting. For example, the annex to TCFD recommendations on implementing the recommendations themselves includes 50 illustrative metrics examples for different industries and sectors. Similarly, the Better Alignment Project, as part of the Corporate Reporting Dialogue, has mapped reporting conducted under CDP, GRI, and CDSB against the 50 illustrative metrics under TCFD. Therefore, if you're already reporting under any of those standards, you can use those for your TCFD reporting purposes. Most of the indicators under CDP, GRI, and CDSB are already TCFD aligned, and where they are not, the Better Alignment Project outlines what you need to do to be TCFD aligned. This should hopefully be easier for you as a preparer and ultimately means it's more useful for users if companies are producing more standardized metrics.
Thank you very much, Sundip. That was a really interesting presentation. And that will lead quite nicely into Marie-Pierre's presentation from Danone's perspective. So with that, I will now pass you over to Marie-Pierre.
I am Marie-Pierre Bousquet from Danone. I am the Science-Based Target Implementation Director, and previously I was the Nature Finance Director, and my background is finance. So I would like to highlight and to give you hopefully some insights on how Danone integrated TCFD recommendations and why. So why, as Sundip mentioned, it is really today the unique international framework on how to disclose risk and opportunities linked to climate change. So there were a lack of alignment and several frameworks, and really TCFD is bringing a lot of clarity on a simple way to address, let's say, the most important requests from the financial community. So really it clarified expectations from investors, regulation authorities of financial markets, and as well the civil society. So as Sundip mentioned already, it's enabling comparison of information among different companies, and for investors and analysts is key. And as well, CDP climate change, which is really a mainstream, let's say, scoring company, align its questionnaires with the TCFD recommendations. So there is really a consistency between the different stakeholders, and how Sundip mentioned, the corporate reporting dialogue is going further in this direction. So for companies, it is really important, and there is a lot of value added to added value, sorry, for giving those guidelines for companies. So TCFD recommendations are as well contributing to raise awareness on climate change impact. So TCFD has been, let's say, created in 2015 during COP21, when I would say there was a very important call to action from the civil society to tackle climate change issues. So it is really focusing on the resilience of business models, the transition risk and opportunities, which is very, let's say, important to understand how companies are going to tackle really climate change and what type of action and strategic decisions are going to be taken. And it is also guiding companies to transform their, let's say, business model, and to, let's say, inform the top management on the climate change impacts. So Leslie, we can go to the next slide, please. Yes, so I would say at Danone, why did we enter in this journey? Because natural capital preservation is absolutely key. As a food company, let's say we are connected and dependent from natural capital like water, soil, and the different, let's say, potential impacts from climate change. So the resilience of Danone business model is a main strategic priority. There is as well an increasing demand from the consumers and from retailers. We are engaged in with retailers. We are engaged in some, let's say, common projects. And so that's why it is as well very important to inform retailers, for instance, via CDP climate change responses. So Danone is actively engaged in the transition to low-carbon economy. And let's say to illustrate, I could mention the acquisition in 2017 of White Wave Food Company in US, which is really specialized in plant-based proposals to customers, and is the leader in the organic food, let's say, production. So it is an illustration on how Danone decided to diversify its portfolio. We were previously offering only animal protein products, and so now we are, let's say, aligning our portfolio with some climate change issues, and also the, let's say, the needs and the trends among consumers. As Sundip mentioned, TCFD is as well aligned with the regulatory frameworks, not only in France, where, let's say, a kind of climate law has been released in 2015, but as well the last framework implemented by the European Commission. So really at Danone, transparency is a matter of trust with our investors and with our other stakeholders, and it is really a matter of credibility and reputation. Just for you to illustrate, this year we are very delighted to be AAA, A for climate change, A for water security, and A as well for forests in the CDP program. So it is, let's say, illustrating the way Danone is really taking seriously those issues. Yes, so I wanted as well show you in terms of metrics and targets how we are and risk assessment as well previously, what we are doing and how we are mentioning what we are doing in our registration document annual reports. So for us, the top, let's say, environmental risk and action are circular economy, water stewardship, regenerative and organic agriculture, and really climate change risk could affect all those challenges. So we put in place a multi-stakeholders process to engage very widely inside the organization, the different parties that may, let's say, have impact on from climate change. We are using as well so different methodologies and tools. I can, for instance, we implemented the water risk assessment and the different tools developed by WWF to assess not only water risk in our operation, but as well in our supply chain. Can go maybe next slide. Yes, so in terms of metrics and targets, here are a very, let's say, summary of what we are doing in terms of CO2 and climate change related KPIs. So firstly, we set science-based target in line with 2 degrees in 2017, and last September we signed the pledge to set science-based target in line with 1.5 degrees. So as you can see, we have several commitments. We have a reduction intensity objective on the full scope, so it means scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And as well an absolute reduction on scope 1 and 2. We join as well the RE 100 initiative to be 100% renewable on electricity by 2030. So we can maybe, yes. So for us, disclosing scope 3 emissions is absolutely obvious. Why? As you can see, it is, let's say, the major part of our emissions, since the agricultural emissions are very significant, especially for the milk production. Since we have a big, let's say, portfolio of brands on dairy products. As well for dairy ingredients, they are used not only in the dairy products, but as well the specialized nutrition products such as infant formulas. And let's say the scope 1 and 2 is not so important at Danone. So we are really engaging with the procurement teams to set targets, then to implement action plans, and to disclose the performance and the different, let's say, project achievements. We can go maybe to the yes. So I would like to give you a few tips for starting the implementation of the TCFD in your company. So firstly, you should not be afraid, since implementing TCFD recommendation is really a journey, and it is how it has been designed. You have to start from somewhere. So again, don't try to, let's say, figure out what are your hotspots in your value chain. And what is really important is to engage internally very widely, depending on your internal stakeholders, and especially the strategic planning teams that are really, let's say, mastering this type of topic. I mean, assessing risk and opportunities that might have impact on your business model. So then what is obvious, as we mentioned, we need to define the relevant KPIs. You need to set targets and then to measure progress against them. How Sundip, Sundip mentioned, really to be transparent, you need to disclose in your mainstream reports, and the CDP climate change is really focused on those issues. So for us, it's really a no-brainer. Maybe to illustrate the journey at Danone, during 2015, during COP21, we released our climate change policy. Actually, at Danone, we started to assess risk and opportunities and setting some internal targets more than 10 years ago. So we started pretty early, again, because it is really key for our sector and for the business strategy of Danone. But really, you can go step by step, and you have probably inside your organization already few initiatives, and very often, actually, the first step is as well to gather and design an internal status on the different action that you're taking in your company. We can go maybe to the next slide, please.
Thank you, Marie-Pierre. Yes, and we have had a couple of questions come in about what departments that you should be involving within your organization when you're trying to kind of start and move on your journey of TCFD. So I think the third point that you touch on here around engaging operations, procurement, finance, hopefully do address that question. But Marie-Pierre, before we move on about gaining buy-in internally, do you have any other advice for the different departments that should be involved?
Yes, so actually I worked very closely with investor relations, someone who is managing the ESG topics, and as well with finance, because really when you want to disclose and assess the financial risk linked to climate change, it is really sustainability teams are complementary to financial teams. At Danone, we are pretty lucky since we ultimately report to the CFO at COMEX level, which is pretty unusual. So that's it.
Brilliant, thank you. And then, as we say, that brings us on to the next slide about gaining internal buy-in.
Yes, so as TCFD mentioned, the first step is for me setting the appropriate governance to really be sure that, let's say, those analyses are not only to inform investors, but need really to be included in your business strategy. So it depends on your activity, but for us, the procurement team are key, for example, since the purchase of goods and services are representing the major part of our emissions. And as well, we are very dependent to natural resources. So it is pretty obvious that this part should be involved, and let's say the dialogue with financial team is absolutely key due to the potential materiality of the impacts. So again, make really your finance teams aware of sustainability issues, because finance teams are, let's say, more focused on, for instance, currency risk, financing risk, let's say, and thus very often they do not have the insights about climate change related risk. So as I mentioned previously, for us it has been really eased by the fact that we are reporting to the CFO. But anyway, I would say it is really important to educate finance teams and for them to be really integrated those aspects in their reflection, risk assessment, business planning, strategic planning, and so on. So as well, KPIs that you are using in your disclosure should be relevant for the business and the decision-making process. If it is not the case, you might have difficulties to really engage internally, and people won't be, let's say, keen to work on those topics. So if you make them really aware of what is at stake, the magnitude of the impact, and they will be obviously aligned with you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Marie-Pierre. I think that is a really important point about making it relevant for your audience. We will just quickly go through a couple of top tips from Sunday, and then we will move over to take a couple of questions. We've got a small few minutes for some questions. So thank you once again, Marie-Pierre. It's a really interesting presentation and an honour to have you here with us today. And also congratulations as well on making the Climate A list, a great achievement.
Yes, thank you very much. You're welcome.
Brilliant. So a couple of top tips from myself and actually reiterates some of the points that Marie's just made. So the first one is TCFD disclosure recommendations should be viewed holistically and connected with the other information in the mentioned report. So the metrics disclosed should tie back to your strategy, risk management processes, and even governance. And as Marie said, don't just disclose generic climate-related metrics that aren't material or relevant for your business. Secondly, the reporting should be both qualitative and quantitative, particularly relevant for metrics and targets. So you need to include both the numbers, but you should also be disclosing the narrative, be explaining how the metrics support the company's risk management process or performance against an identified opportunity, as well as producing narrative on the methodology itself. Third, a lack of comparability can eliminate the decision usefulness of disclosures. So beyond scope 1 and 2 emissions, metrics typically are different from company to company, even within the same industry. Even when the same metric is used, they are often normalized on different basis. So where possible, use existing standards and metrics to make your disclosures. And finally, make as many of the 11 disclosures as possible, but don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And this is similar to what Marie said. We recognize that this is an evolving space. Sector-specific good practice metrics is still being developed. So try and disclose what you can, report what the limitations may be on your reporting, and how you hope to progress in future years.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sandeep. And I just wanted to wrap up with one final slide with some useful resources. Based on the other presentations that we've done in this TCFD series, there has been quite a few requests for more examples on what good practice looks like. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the TCFD Good Practice Handbook that can be accessed via CDSB's website, and that shows good practice examples of what disclosures look like in the annual reports across G20. Also, the corporate reporting dialogue, which Sandeep touched on during his presentation, and then drawing your attention finally to the TCFD Knowledge Hub on the right-hand side. And also last year, the TCFD e-learning courses were launched, which take you through the TCFD recommendations and also look at the role of accountants in tackling climate change. So we do encourage everyone to visit the hub, download the different case studies, white papers, resources, and also sign up for the e-learning courses. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. And again, thank you very much to both of our speakers. We will go through a couple of the questions now. Unfortunately, we are quite tight on time, so we'll make it brief. But if we do not address your question directly during the Q&A session, please do reach out to us on info@cdsb.net, and we can direct your question to the relevant person. So one of the questions that we had come in was around absolute and intensity targets. So the question is, do investors prefer absolute or intensity targets? Perhaps Sandeep, would you like to add something to that?
Sure. It's a good question. I think the answer is actually both are decided. It's not one or the other. So if you take an example around kind of emissions metrics, the standard intensity metrics will allow for comparison with peer companies by using a standardized base, and that's helpful for investors when comparing, different sectors, companies, etc. But at the same time, if the absolute emissions for any one company are very large, regardless of what the intensity may be, it's still important for investors to understand. So actually, I think both kind of intensity and absolute metrics are required and desired by investors.
Thank you very much. We had another question then come in for Marie-Pierre. This is about your disclosure. And how did your disclosure evolve each year? And do you anticipate it kind of evolving from 2020 to 2021?
Yes, so actually what I can tell you is that to ease the reading of our annual report, this year we're going to integrate a table because we have it is, let's say, more than 300 pages. And to help reader to navigate inside this report, we set a table to, let's say, reference the different section where we are talking about climate-related risk and opportunities. For instance, we have a section in the governance part of the company where the different governance bodies are explained and what are their mission. We have also a large section about risk factors. and I could illustrate more. But let's say this simple way to, let's say, highlight your alignment with the TCFD framework is really facilitating the reading by investors, NGOs, and any partners. So now for let's say this year and the coming years, since we signed the 1.5 pledge last September, we are, let's say, intended to develop an analysis much more a deeper analysis on different climate scenarios. And there are different elements that now are, let's say, emerging, like the biodiversity issue. So we are just starting this journey, and probably this aspect is going to be integrated in our annual, let's say, coming annual reports, to give you an example. So we are really understanding the climate change impacts is a journey itself, because it's pretty complex, and unfortunately we see that it has impact on different parts of the natural capital. So it is how we are intended to pursue our analysis and to inform again the top management, and as well in terms of, let's say, governance, we are intended to perform this analysis during the strategic planning, the strategic plan design of this year.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I'll just take one final question before we sign off. And this again is around KPIs and metrics. So other than GHG-based metrics, are there any other examples of KPIs or metrics that you could give?
Alors, for Danone, in our annual report, we are as well providing information around energy consumption, because we have as well some targets to reduce energy consumption. Also, we are performing a deep analysis of our emissions, which is very appreciated by investors, where we are segregating the different effects that are impacting our GHG emissions KPIs. So, for instance, if you are a growing company, if your growth is higher than your reduction actions, you won't decouple your emission, and it would be very difficult to pick your emission. It's just to provide you an example. The intensity KPI is more intended to really see the performance, whatever the growth is. So as I mentioned as well, the renewable electricity linked to RE 100, and what we are as well engaged in regenerative agriculture implementation with our farmers, and we are currently designing the different KPIs and objectives. Last year we were setting our policy, we were starting the action in the field, and now we are designing the KPIs that for sure are going to be disclosed next year. So as you can see, we can go deeper depending on our better understanding on what is at stake, and thus set KPIs to drive teams and to really identify the progress that we're making versus our commitments.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And it sounds like you have a really interesting journey ahead of you. So we definitely look forward to to seeing how that evolves. Well, thank you very much to both of our speakers today for their very interesting presentations, and also thank you to our audience who joined us today and also contributed during the Q&A. As I said, please do reach out to us directly on info@cdsb.net if we didn't get a chance to address your question, or if you have any additional questions on the materials that we shared today. So wishing you all a lovely day, and we hope to see you on future webinars. Bye-bye.